So let's talk about CSS selectors. They are extremely important part of CSS. And really, if we don't do this correctly, we get problems ahead. We really need to think about how we work with CSS selectors because it defines the maintainability of the code and the reusability of the code. We want both, of course. We want to be maintainable. We also want to reuse what we have already written for other projects. To do that, we got to know kind of a lot about this. There's also a part where I'm going to, in the literature, direct you to read or see things that where you learn more about selectors and their significance, and specifically something called unit conversion, cascade, and the specificity. Let's go ahead and look into the more foundational parts first. What is a CSS selector, and why are they important? And how can one select versus how should one select? So you see, these are the things we're trying to address first on. So first off, what is a CSS selectors? Yeah, instead of writing, typing all of this text out and just reading from it, I'll try to explain. If you go to Visual Studio Code and you have this HTML document, and this HTML document has over 1,000 different elements inside of it with different content and all of that. Of course, like I said earlier, you very rarely want to do exactly the same thing with all of them. Of course, you might for some things you might want almost the same thing. Like I said earlier, you probably would like a box sizing of border box on all of them. So there are those occasions, but then again, most of the time they're not. And so you want to select certain things, but there are so many things out there that could be different. It could be so you need a criteria, a pattern to select it. So like saying, for example, if I select something based on what they're called, yeah, I could do that. But then again, more things could be called the same thing. Then I select too much. Well, then maybe I can select something based on how they're structured. Yes, but then again, more things could be selected based on how they're structured. And a question you really gonna ask yourself is, do I want to write something, write declarations in CSS for all of these, or just some of these? And you have to attune your selector so you just select the things you need to. Okay? And this is an overall way of, talking about CSS selectors. Understanding and, efficiently using these CSS selectors is really crucial, because otherwise you will not be able to handle sophisticated layouts or work with projects or reuse parts of projects, like I said earlier. The type of selectors you find out there are generally these. And I took this list directly off of Mozilla Developer Network, which is the link down here. So you can go down and read it. There are pseudoclass, functional pseudoclasses, combinators, simple selectors, compound selectors, complex selectors, relative selectors, selective list. And within each of these, there are a lot of things going on. Not for this one, because this is like it's a selector list. It's one way of doing it, but most of them have different ones of uses, a lot of different uses for each. So you'll find a lot more about them out there. What I really want you to know, though, is what not to use. And usually I'm going to handle things right here, because functional pseudoclasses, we use that a lot, but just in these cases when these are appropriate. Of course, combinators, they're used, they look neat when you use them, but you really need to know, really need to know that this is going to be the case always. The structure is going to be the case always because they rely on the HTML structure to function. So the combinators, if the HTML structure is somehow going to change, then this is not a good idea. And if you are thinking about change on the web page itself, you're thinking too short. It's like if it's going to change between projects, because then it's still not a good idea. Because if I'm creating CSS, I might need to make some kind of changes to it, but I don't want to make a lot of changes to it. When I go from working with one product to a totally different product for another customer, I might want to reuse the same kind of code, right? But then if the whole structure changes too much, and the combinators they really rely on the structure of HTML to be the same, well, then combinators is not a good idea. The same goes for using element selectors, for example, or and so on, because we might change elements. You know that you watched the whole lecture on HTML that the element changes depending on its context. And the context may change, but the structure may be the same. So if I then change the element, then element selectors would not be a good idea. They're also called type selectors. And we'll see them shortly. And then we have the selectors like element selectors are part of the simple selectors. They're inside here. And there's something called the ID selectors, and they're like totally no use. You don't use them. You're not allowed to use. If you use them in my course, I'll fail you. Just the ID, you're totally allowed to use IDs in HTML because they are used all the time for anchor points or to talk to JavaScript if you ever need to do so. If not in my course, but you might need to do it elsewhere. But you never use it, even though you can. You never use this with CSS. Because if I use it as a selector for CSS, it becomes extremely hard to overwrite. And therefore, the reusability and maintainability of the code becomes lacking. So you don't use it for that case. But you use it for other reasons. And well, this is the whole list. And I now encourage you all to go in here and read more about them. And you really need to do that to understand and get examples from it. But also, of course, you'll get examples from me. So let's go ahead into Visual Studio Code and address those examples. Here you go. So I'll actually remove these two and remove this one. And I'll do something different here. I'll take the whole thing. And I'm going to use something that you might find useful to do yourself, something called emmet. And what I'm going to do is type nav. And then I'm going to say inside of that nav, I'm going to do an UL. And inside of that UL, I'll have LIs. And I'm going to, yeah, I think I'll end with that, LIs. And say that there are going to be 5 of them times 5. Cool. Now, in these 4 places, I'm going to just create a link. And I'll do this called link. Now, you see, I've now created a navigation menu with a list including links. So that's what we have here. You see, I did it kind of quickly just by typing a lot of small things. That I hope that spiked your interest. So look into emmets. That's what I did there. I used something called emmets. They just spelled EMMETS. So I encourage you to look into how I did that. Now, what we have here is some kind of hierarchical structure with a nav and a UL and LEs and A's inside of each LI. We'll use that. I think the best idea for me would be to right now put this one to the right and go over here. And then I'll take this code and say split right. So I can have it on the side here at the same time. And now we can see the structure, we can see it visually, we can see the code I applied to it. And the first thing I'll do is address the thing we talked about earlier about box sizing. Now there is a selector called universal selector. It selects everything. So if I say universal selector here, and then go open up my declaration block and say box sizing, border box, and save it. Now every element is now following the instructions of box sizing border box. So I've already written that. And now the next thing I need to do is address this. What I could do, I could actually give nav a name. So for this one I use now nav. It means I'm selecting nav now. So every nav, basically. Every nav on the page. So if I had another nav down here, and in fact, I think we could do that just to make a point. Make a nav down here, and then we give this 3 instead, and we call them hoppa högt. Okay, maybe. So hoppa högt. There you go. So you have link, and we have hoppa högt going on there. And if I type nav and I start my declaration block, and I go in here and say background color, and let's go ahead now and follow our logic. We could just go with like some weird 674. It's a short way as an M abbreviation again. So it actually stands for something larger, where I actually used only 3 letters. So I get this. I got this color. Now I don't want that color. I want to change it. I want to change it to something nicer. So maybe, there you go. I'll save it. And we have this color over here. This color that we just created, I don't know why it adds RGBA there. We don't need it anymore. In the past, to address alpha, we needed the A there. We don't anymore. We have the RGB thing. We have nav, and it affects both of them. Okay. So it means that whenever I'm using an element selected like this, without anything else in there, I'm actually saying I address all of that type. And this is why it's called a type selector. Now we have ways to work around this. We could talk about something called combinator. Combinator is us starting to change what kind of conditions we're looking for. So we're like let's say I just want to change the color of the last one, the last nav. Now what we could do then is say colon, and then say last of type. So the nav that is last of type within its parent, and now there's just only one parent's body. So it jumps there. It has we have added a condition for it. We could also make things really weird. Let's say I have this div around them. Let's go ahead and take this div and just take it to the top and bottom, and we're just nesting this. We can see it's nested inside a div. Everything still works. But let's say now that we are only going to color the navs that are inside of divs. So now we're saying div, inside nav. So we have go to the div, look inside it. If you find a nav, color it. Cool. It worked. Now it doesn't color this one because this is not inside a div. So what happens if I have more divs? Of course, all of those navs that are inside of divs, they're also colored. Let's make that very clear. Let's now make an additional thing. We can say that this whole thing, this nav, is inside a header, which is also a kind of element. Sorry. Really, you should know how hard it is to type when you have a microphone that covers half your screen. So that is what's going on here. I'm saving now. And maybe I should just change this to högre. So right now, what you see is that both of them are chosen. Why is that? I said div, and I said inside div, all of the navs that are inside div. But this is, it might feel confusing for some of you that if I look at div here, nav is inside div. In this case, header is inside div. Yeah, but nav is also inside of div, right? It's just further in. And this thing with just a space, it makes no distinction between how far in it is. And to make that distinction, you have to make use of a combinator. It says this. There's a combinator called, even like that. So it says all the navs that are directly inside are direct children of div. So this is the direct children, this is not. Okay, then we save. And suddenly things appear, and we got this one chosen for us. So combinators work like this. And that might be neat, that might be what we want. But then suddenly if things change, then someone changed this in the structure. For example, we added a header up here or something else. Then if we did that, suddenly the color would not appear. So it's dependent on the structure being very similar, which is why it's not always reusable. We don't really use it all the time. We use it when we know that the structure almost 100% of the times will remain the same. And it's very hard to reach that 100% certainty of that. So these are combinators. So I have a couple of different combinators. So we have to work with. We have the plus sign, we have the tilde, we have this one. There are more. And I encourage you all to look them up. But you should also know that in this course, we'll try to use them sometimes, but sparingly. What we use a lot more, though, is something called classes. And we'll get to that soon. But first, let's talk about the difference between class and ID. So here I have class, and I can add an extra attribute called ID. And class says, we could call this class link. We could actually call this one link 2, just to call them the same right now. Now that's not a problem. At this point, no problem. Now let's do it again. Or the next one, 13. And suddenly we get this wiggly, weird line afterwards, and it says something. The ID value link must be unique. And it's not, because this one has an ID value of link. It does not complain on class. It's because these two are really different. Classes, you can, be classed as a couple of things. You can have many classes on you. For example, if you imagine yourself, you are a living thing. That is a class a lot of other animals has as well. But then you're also classed as a human. That is not a class all other animals has. And then you are classed as an English-speaking individual. Otherwise, you would not understand what I say right now anyway. So you can speak English or understand English. That is not something all other humans would have. So you could really have many classes upon yourself that distinguish you that others have or do not have. But an ID is basically like your personal ID, the personal ID you got on your you use for traveling and all of that. That personal ID is unique to you and you alone. And it's extremely specific. And therefore, it's actually incorrect. And it's an error whenever you write it like this, when you have the same ID. So that's one thing. It's meant, the ID is meant for one thing and one thing alone, never to be repeated. It's extremely specific. So when I write this, let us look at these two. I'm going to save right now so we can have this, and I'm going to say class. No, sorry, not class. I'm going to say dot, and I say link. Dot, it means I'm going to write a class now. And I'm writing the class name I added out there. I said link. I could have said APA if I want to. It would have made so much sense. Class naming is really important. But I want to make the point that actually the name there, you could change it to almost anything. Not starting with a number though. And then I started my declaration block and I want to change the color. So let's change the color to, what should we do? Red. And it's this. So I'm saving it and really nothing happens right now. It's because I think I didn't save this one either. So here you go. I saved it. A box model now is saved here in HTML and CSS is saved. I see that no white dot up here. We have link. Both of them are red. So let me then see what happens if I add hashtag and then I said link. So if I write hashtag, it indicates I'm going to then name an ID. So I'm using the ID link here. And then I'm going to say color. And then let's go with something different. Let's go with blue violet or something. And just to, I'm usually taking a shortcut of just taking some name and then start give my own color. But it's up there. And you can see it's purple, but this one is still red. Okay, that makes sense. We have now said we're going to change this one that has the ID link to purple. Okay, but why? Why does it make sense? I also say it's going to be red. So why does it decide purple is it? Now, if you think about it, it could be two things. First up, this is the last one mentioned. And that is actually a part of the rules that you'll see in the cascade. That if everything else is equal, the last one mentioned, the last declaration mentioned is the one that's going to be used. So in this case, it could be that, but it's not. I could even mention this one before, like adding like this, and it would still keep on being the same. I've saved it, and still we can see it is very clear that this one is not the same color. We have this purple color in it. You can make it really overabundantly clear, blue up there, and then we can change this to green if you see it. Now it just almost disappeared. But at least you see it changes. It is not red, even though this one appears last. It is because of something called specificity. And I will head you to lectures, to reading on this, because it's going to be part of both quizzes and assignments in the future and the project. But I can hover over it and see that we have something that individual code tells us. about the selector specificity. It says we have a value 1 colon 0 colon 0. And it says that this value is 0 colon 1 colon 0. So if I'm saying it has a higher specificity, it actually indicates that there's a value more to the left here. So values over here on the far right, they have a lower specificity. They're like the lowest ones. And then those the furthest to the left, they are really the highest. And specificity, how specific we are, is deciding which rule that's going to be applied. So since it's hard, this one is really high, we are very certain it's going to be green wherever we put it. And link, though, it's weaker. So it could be overwritten. And these two, God damn it, they're just a two far to the right. They're much, much weaker. And this one, it's nothing. Everyone can overwrite this one. So they have different specificity. And why on earth would I say a high specificity is a bad thing? Now, remember maintainability. We want to be able to make changes on our code during the process. Things happens. Years ahead, a lot of things would have happened with your code. And if you always need to overwrite stuff that has a really high specificity, things are become really hard to maintain. We want to make it easy for us to override previously written declarations. Okay, so bring that with you into the future, because that is why I'm totally never accepting ID ever as a selector inside of this course. Not as a selector. In other cases, of course, you can use ID, for example, as an anchor or as a hook for JavaScript. But as you know, it's not a big part of this code. JavaScript is not part of it at all. So this is some of the really important ones. And then they have the pseudo classes. We have pseudo elements. And we have really neat ones. Like, for example, let's say I have let's say we take this thing that we have. I'm going to remove these two. And I can also remove this to make it easier to read. And we have all of them. And now I'm going to copy this one, this nav, like a lot of times. And now we are. I want to select everything except this one. I want to do something on everything except this one. So what should I do? Maybe I want to do this background color on everything except this one. And I could say that just to make sure that we know that we attack this one. So note this one. So now we know when we look into the text over here that we want everything to be affected, but not this one. So how should we do that? Let's start then by saying nav. And then we say, so we want to select a nav, but not. And then we can say not. We select everything but this one. And then we say, go in here and we type nth. And this is another one we can use here. Nth child. So then we say which child. So let's go in here and say 1, 2, 3. The third. So everything but the third. I'm going to change the background color. Now this gets complex, right? And there's more. They're like, we have the has selector, is selector, where selector, and has is a powerful thing. Not is a really powerful thing, and where is useful as hell. But the other ones I don't use as much. But if I want you to like really look into something that you would find useful, I would go with the has one and the not one you just saw. And also understand the value of having no specificity at all that we can get while using this one. Not always, but on some occasions. So having done that, I think I've introduced you a lot to what specificity about selectors there are. There are so many more, but you can go to the link in that I showed you earlier and find more. Mozilla Developer Network is actually a really good place to find many, many, many examples like this. There's also this thing called CSS selectors on V3 schools, which you can go to, which is have a neat table showing you how they're supposed to function, and so on. With that said, let's go into the next part of this lecture.